Jake had always enjoyed the solitude of his small cabin on the outskirts of a barren moon. The quiet was something he had come to cherish after years of working as a mechanic for the Galactic Transport Corporation. Now, his days were spent fixing broken machinery, maintaining his small farm, and staring up at the endless stars above. The moon, a lifeless ball of dust, offered no distractions, just the peace he longed for. One cold evening, as Jake was finishing his work in the garage, he heard a faint noise outside. It wasn't the usual wind howling through the rocks. No, this sound was different, sharp, like something metal had collided with the ground. He grabbed his jacket and hurried outside, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. To his surprise, there was a strange glow coming from the distance. It wasn't a typical star or ship, it was something new, something alien. Without thinking, Jake set off toward the source of the light, his heart pounding with curiosity and fear. The glow grew brighter as he approached, and soon he could see a large, wrecked ship lying in a shallow valley. Its sleek metallic surface shimmered in the dim light of the moon. The ship was clearly damaged, its hull torn open as though it had crashed violently into the ground. Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But the sight of the wreckage stirred something inside him, an urge to help. He wasn't a hero, but his training as a mechanic had taught him to handle emergencies. He had dealt with broken ships before, even when the odds were against him. So, despite the strange circumstances, he approached the wreckage. As he neared the ship, he noticed two figures lying on the ground near the wreckage. They were humanoid in shape, but their skin glowed with a faint, shimmering light. One of them was unconscious, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The other was sitting up, but she looked weak and disoriented. Her eyes were a strange shade of violet, and her hair seemed to shift in color as if it was alive, moving like a soft wave in the wind. Jake knelt beside them, his heart racing. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper as he gently touched the woman's shoulder. She flinched at first, but then her eyes focused on him, and she blinked in confusion. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Don't worry. I'm going to help you," Jake said, more to reassure himself than to comfort her. He was unsure of what was happening, but instinct told him that these creatures, whatever they were, needed his help. The other woman, still unconscious, was in worse shape. Her breathing was faint, and she seemed completely out of it. Jake stood up and scanned the area for any signs of danger. There was no sign of any other ships or people nearby, which was a relief. He quickly turned back to the two women. The one who was awake seemed to be regaining some strength, her violet eyes focusing on him as if studying him. "Can you understand me?" Jake asked cautiously, though he wasn't sure what kind of answer he expected. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and something else he couldn't quite place. She was trying to speak, but her words were foreign to him, sharp and melodic, like music, but without any meaning he could grasp. Jake crouched beside her and did his best to offer her comfort. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to help." He glanced over at the unconscious woman again. He needed to get them both back to his cabin, where he could treat their wounds and give them food. But the ship, their ship, was beyond repair. Jake could tell just by looking at it that it was completely destroyed. With no other options, Jake carefully lifted the awake woman into his arms, the strange softness of her glowing skin unnerving him. She was light, almost weightless, and yet there was a subtle power in the way she moved. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, but her strength seemed to radiate from her, even in her weakened state. He carried her back to his cabin, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had settled deep in his chest. What were these creatures? Where had they come from? And why had they crashed here? His mind raced with questions, but for now, the only thing he could do was focus on getting them to safety. When he arrived at his cabin, Jake laid the woman on his small bed and moved to check on the unconscious one. The second woman was much more fragile looking, her chest barely rising with each shallow breath. Her skin was pale compared to the first one, but it still shimmered faintly, and her hair seemed to be streaked with colors like the aurora borealis. Jake worked quickly, using the basic medical supplies he had on hand to try and stabilize her. He didn't know what kind of medicine or treatments these beings needed, but he had to try. As he worked, the first woman, still sitting on the bed, watched him closely, her eyes never leaving his face. She seemed to be studying him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. After a few tense minutes, the second woman's breathing began to steady. Jake let out a sigh of relief, wiping his brow. He wasn't a doctor, but he'd done enough to keep people alive during his years as a mechanic on remote moons. He hoped it was enough. Turning his attention back to the woman on the bed, Jake made a decision. He wasn't sure what to expect from these strange beings. But one thing was clear. He couldn't leave them out there, helpless and alone. They needed shelter, food, and protection. With his mind set on caring for them, Jake went to the kitchen and began preparing something to eat. He had enough supplies to make a simple meal, though he wasn't sure what these creatures would eat. Still, it was the best he could do. As he prepared the food, the first woman stood and moved closer to him, her movements graceful and fluid. She had not spoken since he had brought them to the cabin, but now she spoke in that strange melodic language. Her voice was soft, almost musical, and her words carried a weight that Jake couldn't fully comprehend. "I will help," she said in broken English, her voice low but clear. "Thank you." Jake looked at her, surprised by the sudden communication. "You can understand me?" he asked, unsure if he had heard correctly. The woman nodded. "We understand, but not many words."
"You are kind."
Jake didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't expecting thanks, especially not from alien beings, but it felt good, in a strange way, to be appreciated. Despite the overwhelming circumstances, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of connection with these beings. There was something about their presence that stirred something deep inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As the evening wore on, the second woman regained consciousness, her violet eyes fluttering open. She looked around, confused, and then her gaze settled on Jake. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him was enough to make his heart race. It was a look that held gratitude, but also something more, a sense of awe, perhaps, or even recognition. The two sisters looked at each other, and for the first time since their crash, there was a soft smile between them. They didn't speak, but their eyes said everything. They were no longer strangers, they were allies, and they were in his debt. Jake didn't know what to expect next. He didn't know who or what these beings were, or what they wanted, but one thing was certain. His life had just become far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. He had helped them, yes, but in doing so, he had become part of something far bigger than himself, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened next would change the course of his life forever. As the night stretched on and the two sisters ate the meal Jake had prepared, he sat back, watching them closely. There was much he didn't understand, but one thing was clear. These two alien beings, fragile yet powerful, had come into his life for a reason, and somehow he knew that they would not be leaving any time soon. The days that followed were a blur of new experiences for Jake. He had always lived a solitary life on the barren moon, working alone and keeping to himself. But now, with the two strange women in his cabin, everything had changed. He could feel the weight of their presence, their unspoken thoughts hanging in the air like a constant, invisible force. They were unlike anything he had ever encountered, aliens from another world, with features so foreign and yet so captivating. The first woman, who had been the more awake and responsive of the two, had introduced herself as Lyra. Her violet eyes seemed to hold endless knowledge, and her shimmering skin changed colors depending on her mood. Jake had learned quickly that she was intelligent, capable, and resourceful. She was still cautious around him, but it was clear she trusted him more than she had at first. The second woman, whom Jake had initially found unconscious and frail, had recovered just as quickly. Her name was Sora. Unlike her sister, Sora was more reserved, often remaining silent as Lyra communicated with Jake. But when she did speak, her voice carried a quiet strength. There was something about her, an air of mystery, that made Jake feel as though there was more to her than met the eye. At first, the two sisters had been unable to explain much about themselves or their mission. Their language was a blend of sounds and symbols that Jake couldn't begin to decipher. But Lyra was patient, and over time, they developed a way of communicating. She would speak in a mix of their alien language and broken English, and Jake would piece together what she could explain. Slowly, the puzzle of their story began to take shape. They were survivors of a crashed spaceship, stranded on this desolate moon after a violent encounter with an enemy force. Their ship had been damaged beyond repair, and they had been lucky to survive the crash. But now, they were stranded, with no way to contact their home world or continue their mission. Lyra had explained that they were part of an intergalactic peacekeeping effort, sent to deliver a message of hope to the galaxy's most powerful races. But their enemies, a ruthless faction that sought to dominate the universe, had intercepted their ship and destroyed it. Now they had no choice but to rely on Jake for help. Jake didn't know what to think of their story. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, too far-fetched to be real. But the more he spent time with the sisters, the more he felt that there was truth in their words. Their knowledge, their abilities, and the way they moved, everything about them was otherworldly. They weren't lying, they were survivors, and they needed help. Jake's cabin, which had once been his quiet refuge, now felt like a prison. The sisters didn't mean to make him feel this way, but the constant tension between them all was hard to ignore. There was a silence that lingered between them, a silence that spoke volumes. Lyra would often study him with those deep, violet eyes, as if trying to read his thoughts. Sora, on the other hand, kept to herself, her gaze distant, her mind always elsewhere. It was clear that the sisters were carrying a heavy burden, one that Jake couldn't even begin to understand. Over the course of the next few days, Jake did his best to help them. He worked on their ship's damaged systems, trying to find a way to repair it, but it was hopeless. The ship was beyond saving. Still, Jake didn't give up. He had spent years fixing broken machines, and he wasn't about to stop now. He knew the sisters needed a way to contact their people, to continue their mission, and he was determined to help them find a solution. In the evenings, Jake would cook simple meals for the three of them, trying to keep things as normal as possible. He noticed that the sisters seemed to appreciate the food, though they never spoke much about it. Lyra would occasionally thank him, but Sora remained silent, her eyes fixed on the fire or the stars outside. It was clear that they were both haunted by something that they weren't ready to share. One evening, as Jake was cleaning up after dinner, Lyra approached him. She didn't speak at first, just stood there watching him with her piercing violet eyes. Jake wiped his hands on a towel, feeling the weight of her gaze. There was something about the way she looked at him, something that made him feel both uncomfortable and strangely drawn to her. "I'm sorry," Lyra said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "We didn't mean to burden you." Jake looked up, surprised by her words. "It's not a burden," he replied. "You two are different, but not in a bad way. I'm just trying to help." Lyra nodded, though her expression remained serious.
"You don't know what you're getting into," she said quietly.
We are not like your people. We come from a world far beyond the stars, and our mission is one of great importance. The people we are fighting against." She paused, her gaze flickering toward the window. "They will stop at nothing to find us. To find you." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Lyra hesitated before answering. "The message we carry is dangerous. It holds the key to the survival of our people. But if it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything. Jake didn't know what to say to that. It was all so overwhelming. Alien races, intergalactic wars, messages that could save or destroy entire worlds. It sounded like something out of a dream. Something that couldn't possibly be real. But Lyra's expression, the fear in her eyes, told him otherwise. They're already looking for us, Lyra continued. And if they find us here, they will destroy everything. Our mission, our people, your world. Jake's heart raced as the weight of her words sank in. He had no idea what he was dealing with, but one thing was clear. His life would never be the same again. These two women weren't just stranded aliens. They were part of something far bigger than anything he could have imagined. I don't want to get anyone else involved, Lyra said, almost as if reading his mind. But we need to be careful. We can't stay here forever. If they find us, I won't let them, Jake interrupted, his voice firm. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. These two women had trusted him with their lives, and he wasn't going to let them down. Lyra's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of gratitude passing through them. Thank you, she whispered. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but Jake could sense that they had reached a new understanding. He didn't know what the future held. But one thing was certain. He was now part of something far beyond anything he had ever expected. And whether he was ready or not, his life was about to take a turn into the unknown. The next morning, Jake set to work again, determined to find a way to help the sisters. He spent hours poring over the wreckage of their ship, trying to salvage what he could. It was difficult work, and the hours passed quickly, but Jake felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. In the evenings, they would sit together, the three of them, sharing stories in broken English and alien words. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Jake to begin to feel like they were becoming more than just strangers. He was starting to understand them, starting to see beyond their alien features. They were more than just survivors. They were people with hopes, dreams, and fears just like him. But even as they grew closer, Jake knew the danger was never far away. The enemy, whoever they were, was still out there, and Jake wasn't sure how much time they had left before they came for them. As the days wore on, Jake found himself wondering more and more about the sisters' mission. What was the message they carried? And why was it so important? Lyra had hinted at the significance of their mission, but she had never fully explained it. Perhaps, Jake thought, it wasn't something she could explain yet. But the more time he spent with them, the more he realized that whatever they were involved in, it was far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The answers, he knew, were out there. And as the sun set on another quiet evening, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was coming, that the future, whatever it held, was fast approaching. Jake sat on the worn wooden chair by the window, staring out into the cold, barren landscape. The wind howled softly, its sound a constant companion on this lonely moon. It had been days since the sisters had arrived, and still, he wasn't sure what to make of the situation. They were kind and grateful, yes, but there was always that undercurrent of something darker between them, a secret they weren't ready to share. Lyra, the more open of the two, had continued to speak in fragments of their language and broken English. With each passing day, Jake learned more, but the truth still seemed just out of reach. The sisters had arrived on his doorstep, clearly desperate, and Jake had done what he could to help them. But their mission, the weight of it, was something far beyond what he could understand. He rubbed his tired eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue that had settled deep in his bones. Repairing their ship was a lost cause, but he couldn't stop himself from trying. The damage was too severe, and even his knowledge of mechanics couldn't fix something this complex. Still, he couldn't help but feel a responsibility to them. They were stranded on his moon, with nowhere else to go. That night, after a simple dinner of soup and bread, Jake sat in his cabin's small living room, his thoughts consumed with the sisters' mysterious mission. Sora had said little since her recovery, her gaze distant, often lost in thought, but when she did speak, her words carried a weight that left Jake with more questions than answers. "What is it that you're not telling me?" Jake had asked Lyra the day before. "I know there's something more to your mission. I can see it in your eyes." Lyra had hesitated, glancing at Sora before speaking. "It's dangerous," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The message we carry, it could change everything. But if it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy entire worlds." Jake had tried to make sense of her words, but they only raised more questions. Who were these enemies they spoke of, and why was their mission so important? It seemed like a story pulled from the pages of a book, but there was a sincerity in Lyra's eyes that told him this wasn't fiction. Whatever they were involved in, it was real, and it was dangerous. He hadn't been able to get much more out of her, but he didn't push. It was clear that Lyra and Sora were still adjusting to their new circumstances, and Jake didn't want to press them too hard. Still, the weight of their secret hung heavy in the air. He could feel it when he was with them, like an invisible thread tying them together in something he couldn't quite understand. A few nights later, Jake woke to a strange noise. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing through the stillness of the cabin. He sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to make sense of the sound. It was coming from the direction of the wrecked ship. He grabbed his jacket and rushed outside, his breath visible in the cold night air. As he neared the ship's remains, he saw Lyra standing there, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't notice him approach at first, her attention fixed on something in the distance. Her skin was glowing faintly in the dark, and her hands were trembling as she pointed toward the horizon. "They're coming," she said, her voice shaking. "They've found us." Jake's blood ran cold. He had suspected that the sisters' enemies were out there, but to hear Lyra say it aloud was something entirely different. He followed her gaze, scanning the dark sky for any sign of movement. There was nothing, but the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Lyra turned to him, her eyes filled with desperation. "We need to leave, now!" Jake didn't hesitate. He had no idea who was coming, or how long they had, but he wasn't about to sit back and wait for whatever was out there to find them. He grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her toward the cabin. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice low but urgent. As they rushed back into the cabin, Jake's mind raced. He couldn't let these enemies find them. He couldn't let them destroy everything. But what could he do? His cabin was small, isolated, and there was no way to escape if they were under attack. Once inside, Jake turned to Sora, who had been silent through the entire exchange. She stood by the door, her expression unreadable. "We need to move," Jake said, his voice steady but tense. "Lyra says they've found us." "They'll be here soon." Sora nodded silently, her eyes betraying no emotion. She didn't speak, but Jake could see the fear in her gaze. It was there, buried deep, just beneath the surface. She didn't want to show it, but Jake could feel it. The sisters were in trouble. And now, so was he. Lyra moved to a corner of the room and began to work at a small device on the floor. It was one of the few pieces of their ship that hadn't been destroyed, and Jake had no idea what it was or how it worked. But Lyra seemed to know. She fiddled with it for a few moments, then turned to Jake. "This will help us hide," she said, her voice urgent. "But it won't hold them off for long. We need to be ready to move." Jake didn't understand, but he didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, trying to keep his mind clear. There was no time for hesitation. He couldn't afford to be overwhelmed by the situation. After a few moments, the device powered up with a low hum and the lights in the cabin flickered. Jake felt a strange sensation wash over him, like a wave of static electricity. It didn't last long, but when it passed, the cabin felt different, almost invisible, as if they had become a part of the landscape, blending in with the night. Lyra looked at Jake with a faint, weary smile. "This will give us some time, but we need to move fast." Jake nodded again, feeling a sense of determination settle over him. He wasn't going to let these enemies destroy the sisters. He wouldn't let them destroy everything he had worked for. He would fight, even if it meant his life was on the line. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "What's the plan?" Lyra and Sora exchanged a look, and for the first time since they had arrived, they seemed to share a silent understanding. Whatever was coming, they were ready to face it. "We need to find a way off this moon," Lyra said. "We need to contact our people. But we can't do it from here. They'll be watching. We need to move to a more secure location." Jake felt a pang of worry in his chest. "But where do we go?" "There's nowhere else on this moon. It's all barren." "There's nothing out there. We'll find it," Lyra replied firmly. "We've survived this long. We can survive a little longer." Jake didn't argue. He didn't know how much longer they had before the enemy arrived. But he wasn't about to give up now. They had come this far, and he was going to help them finish what they had started. With a final glance at the device in the corner, Lyra turned and led the way out of the cabin. Sora followed silently, her footsteps soft and deliberate. Jake took a deep breath and followed them into the night. The cold wind stung his face as they moved through the barren landscape. The stars above were bright, but they offered no comfort. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was coming, that something was about to change. And whatever it was going to be big. As they moved forward, Jake couldn't help but wonder what the future held. What were the sisters' enemies after? Why had they chosen this moon of all places to search for them? And most importantly, what role would he play in this fight for survival? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of distant footsteps. Faint, but growing louder. Someone was coming. And they weren't alone. The time for answers was over. The fight for survival had begun. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he and the sisters moved through the darkness. The cold wind cut through his jacket, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed with the sound of footsteps that grew louder with each passing moment. They were close now. The enemy had arrived. Lyra led the way, her movements swift and purposeful. She didn't hesitate, even though the landscape around them was desolate, a vast expanse of jagged rocks and dry, cracked earth. Jake could feel the tension in the air, a palpable weight pressing down on him. Sora moved beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon, her face expressionless, but Jake could sense the fear hidden beneath her calm exterior. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had always been a mechanic, someone who fixed broken things and made a living on a quiet, forgotten moon. Now, he was part of something far bigger. Something dangerous. These two alien sisters, stranded and hunted, had turned his life upside down, and he couldn't walk away now. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, his voice low as he kept pace with them. Lyra glanced over her shoulder, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "There's a safe house nearby," she said. "It's hidden. We can rest there and figure out our next move." Jake nodded, though he still didn't understand everything. He wasn't sure what they were hiding from or why their enemies wanted them so badly, but there was one thing he knew for sure. They were in danger, and if they didn't act fast, it might be too late. They continued their journey, the sound of their footsteps the only noise breaking the silence of the night. The wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of dust and cold stone. The stars above seemed distant, indifferent to the events unfolding below. But Jake could sense that everything had changed. His quiet, isolated life had been replaced by something more intense, something that threatened to consume him. After what felt like hours, they reached the entrance to the safe house. It was a small, hidden cave nestled between two large rock formations. From the outside, it looked like any other part of the barren landscape, but once inside, it was clear that the sisters had made it their home, a temporary refuge in the middle of nowhere. Lyra moved quickly, checking the area for any signs of danger before leading them inside. Sora followed silently, her eyes still scanning the surroundings. Jake stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The cave was small but well organized. There were a few makeshift beds, some scattered supplies, and a small portable device in the corner that Jake assumed was part of their communication equipment. "Are we safe here?" Jake asked, his voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and worry. "For now," Lyra replied, her tone sharp, "but not for long. We need to figure out how to contact our people." Jake nodded, still trying to wrap his mind around everything. It was all so overwhelming. Aliens, enemies, secret missions. He had never signed up for any of this, but as much as he wanted to go back to his quiet life, he knew he couldn't abandon the sisters now. They had trusted him, and he wasn't going to let them down. Lyra turned to him, her violet eyes fixed on him with a look that sent a chill down his spine. "Jake," she said softly, "there's something we need to tell you, something you don't know." Jake's heart skipped a beat. What could they possibly need to tell him now? He had a feeling that whatever it wasn't going to make things any easier. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Lyra took a deep breath, her gaze flickering briefly to Sora before meeting Jake's eyes once again. "The message we carry, it's not just important. It's vital. Our people are on the brink of destruction, and if we don't deliver it, the war will spread to every corner of the galaxy." "Our enemies." She paused, swallowing hard. "They're not just after us. They're after the weapon we've been hiding." Jake's mind raced. "Weapon?" he asked, the words sending a shockwave through his thoughts. "What kind of weapon?" Lyra's eyes darkened.
"It's an ancient device," she explained. "A weapon capable of ending the war in one stroke."
"But it must never fall into the wrong hands. If our enemies get their hands on it, they'll use it to destroy everything." Jake was silent for a long moment, trying to process what Lyra had just said. A weapon of such power, hidden by two alien sisters who were now stranded on a forgotten moon. It sounded like a story out of a science fiction novel, but the fear in Lyra's eyes told him this was no story. It was real. "We didn't know it was here," Lyra continued. "We didn't realize the weapon had been hidden on this moon until it was too late. Now we have to keep it safe. We have to protect it from those who would use it to destroy everything." Jake looked between Lyra and Sora, who had remained silent throughout the conversation. He could see the weight of what they were carrying in their eyes, the responsibility, the fear, the uncertainty. These sisters weren't just survivors of a crash. They were protectors of something much larger, something that could change the fate of the entire galaxy. "So, what do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. Lyra paused as though weighing her options. "We need to find a way to contact our allies," she said, "but it won't be easy. Our enemies are already looking for us. They'll stop at nothing to find the weapon, and they won't hesitate to kill anyone who stands in their way." Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had known they were in danger, but hearing it from Lyra's lips made it all the more real. They weren't just hiding from some simple band of enemies. They were up against a powerful force, one that would stop at nothing to achieve its goals. "Do you have a plan?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the answer. Lyra nodded slowly. "We'll need to move again soon," she said.
"But we can't go back to your cabin. It's too exposed."
"We'll have to find another way to contact our people. Somewhere far enough from here that they won't be able to track us." Jake stood in the center of the cave, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He had no idea what he was getting into, but one thing was certain. He couldn't turn back now. He had promised to help the sisters, and he intended to keep that promise. "What's the next step?" he asked, his voice firm. Lyra turned to Sora, who had been silent until now. Sora met Jake's gaze for the first time that night, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Then, without a word, she moved to the device in the corner of the cave and began to work. It was clear that they had a plan, though Jake had no idea what it was. As the night wore on, the sisters worked in silence, their movements efficient and precise. Jake stayed out of the way, unsure of what to do next. He was caught in a strange, unsettling feeling, half fear, half determination. His life had changed in ways he couldn't understand, and he didn't know what the future held. But as long as he had the sisters by his side, he knew he couldn't give up. He wouldn't let them down. Eventually, after what felt like hours, Lyra stood up from the device and turned to Jake. "We're ready," she said quietly. Jake nodded, his heart racing. The time to act had come. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time since they had arrived, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just helping two strangers anymore. He was part of something much bigger, and whatever happened next, he was going to face it, head on. The enemy was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, but Jake knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them win. Not if he could help it.